Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode 232, and I am joined today by a special guest. Maybe some of you might have already be familiar with her from a Facebook Live interview we did recently, but this is Jennifer Ruelens from Fish Property Management in Pennsylvania. How you doing, Jen?
Hi, how are you, Eric? Great.
I'm doing pretty well. And just to kind of hone in a little bit, you're from Williamsport, Pennsylvania, correct?
Yep, that's right.
And a little bit about Fish Property Management, just to kind of give our listeners kind of some background information on what you do.
Yeah, we are the largest housing provider in Clinton and Lycoming counties in Pennsylvania. So we manage and rent single-family homes and small multifamily properties. We're managing, just close to 700 rentals right now, and we love doing it here, and we're good at it.
All right. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today is eviction tips. So you and I were discussing before, and you said, yeah, there's a certain protocol of what you do during an eviction, but there's also this emotional element for the landlord property manager as you're going through it. And there's things that you can do as far as coaching and different things to make the process easier. And we're going to kind of walk people through it. So if you're going through an eviction for the first time as a landlord property manager, it's stressful, right?
And I meet a lot of people who are doing this, and it wears on them. It keeps them up at night. And I'll tell you, if you think about it this way, you have a landlord and you have a tenant, and they're in a conflict, right? And it's a big conflict because for the tenant, it's about their housing, and that's huge. And if it's for the landlord, it's about a huge sum of money and an investment that they've made.
Mm-hmm.
And if neither party really knows expertly how to handle this, it's going to result in confusion and fear and anxiety and resentment for both parties. And that's when you get things like self-help evictions, you get things like screaming matches, countersuits, and then you get, housing or buildings that are damaged out of spite or resentment or anger. And I think that's what landlords fear. And I think that there's some tips I can give that will help just bring those emotions down and make this a business matter. It is still hard, but it's something that can be easier, for sure.
All right. I'm really looking forward to this because I like when we have guests on, we have content like this that can help somebody who's in a really tough spot. And I don't know if there's a tougher position for landlords than when they're going through an eviction, especially the first time. So this is going to be great help for somebody who might be working through that. So why don't we run a little intro music for our podcast listeners, and we'll roll that and we'll get into it right after this. All right, Jen, why don't we start at the very beginning? Let's create a hypothetical scenario. A landlord is right now, they know that they need to evict somebody. They whatever the reason is, damage, late rent, nuisance. But what's your first steps? What do you tell somebody who's in this situation? What do they need to do to get started with the process? And, if you're coaching them, what are you going to tell them?
Yeah, I'd actually advocate, let's start from at the very beginning. I think part of de-escalating this starts from the very beginning before you've even leased it. And that's to vet your tenant. And that's something you guys know a ton about. But we're vetting your tenant and knowing that they qualify for income and credit and all of that. What that does for the landlord is know that you didn't make a mistake. You didn't set them up to fail. Something happened, and that's really important. You didn't take advantage of them. So no, I did the first thing I could do better than anyone. And you could use rent prep for that. But then when you sign the lease, when you go over the lease, something that people skip, they talk about late fees, they talk about when it's due. Do they actually go through an example and say, tenant, let's just pretend it's the first of the month, your rent's $1,000 and you can pay part of it or you can't pay all of it. I advocate, and we walk them through the process. So we say, what's going to happen on the 4th of the month after the grace period? We're going to post that notice to quit. And it's going to look like this. It's going to be taped on the door. In our state, it has to be put out open, like you could walk by and read everything it says. And we let them know that. We go, well, you don't have a choice. That's the law. And then 10 days after this, we file. And then there's going to be a hearing in this many days. This is what happens there. And after that hearing, we go do this, and then you're out. And that process in our state takes about 6 weeks. We just put it out there up front. And the purpose of that is they're not going to remember it. They don't write it down, but it's communicating I know what I'm doing. So if you're on the 30th of the month and you've got $1,500 and $2,500 worth of bills, I want you to choose to pay your rent first. I want to set you up to make a better decision. And then if you choose not to, you know what's going to happen. It's not a mystery. It's not because I'm coming after you. It's because this is the arrangement and what we agreed to.
Okay.
You don't get a time after you sign the lease. That's the friendliest the relationship ever is when you're signing the lease. Everybody's happy. Everybody's thrilled. You are going to love each other. So set it up from that part. Now, if you get to the point where you're delinquent to where you wanted to start, the important thing to remember is to calm down as the landlord, because I think if you're a landlord, and rightfully so, you've invested money, you've invested time, you've taken care of it, and now you're not getting your money. And now you're going to have to pull from somewhere else to pay that mortgage or whatever it is. So granted, you're being put out. Remember, you need to just take those emotions down on your end. This is business. And you want to make sure you're not going to subscribe to any of these things you read about on the internet and the forums, the self-help, they talk about talking them out. They talk about taking the doors off. They talk about shutting off the water or talking about shutting off the water. All of these things, obviously, we all know are not appropriate, but they get real tempting in that moment, because in that moment, the landlord's thinking, how am I going to do this? Ooh, I don't want to call the attorney. They cost a lot. Maybe I can solve this on my own. So take it off the table. Like maybe you fantasize about it for a minute and then you take it off the table.
Yeah.
You have a rich fantasy life and then you realize that's not the thing to do. Now, find out how an eviction works, because the way you can do this successfully is if somebody in the situation knows what they're doing. So in this case, maybe the landlord takes the time to go find it out and learn it. Maybe you have an attorney, maybe you have a property manager. And I feel strongly that if you can put an expert into a situation, you've just de-escalated it. So hopefully for the landlord, they are their own expert. And I believe even if you've never had an eviction in 10 years, if you're in this business, you need to know how evictions work in your state. You need to know every single step and be ready, because that's what's going to save you. So if you're getting into that, you're going to start it, you know what you're doing, you've communicated, you know what you're doing. You're going to sit down with that tenant and go, listen, I'm offering you my time. We're in this position now. There's a delinquency. I want to tell you what's going to happen. And they're going to be receptive, because all they want to know is what's going to happen. Yep. They know they didn't pay the rent. They know, like, it's not a mystery. They know. And they also know if you set this up right, that you're going to do something about it swiftly. We're not going to wait 2 weeks to call you about it and mess around. We're going to do it right away. And you're going to tell them, hey, listen, I'm offering you the time. If you want it, I don't force it on them, but if you want it, then you go through it, and you go through it by the dates. How is this going to work? The best that you know how to describe. And what you've just done is take all the fear and anxiety out. Because you can imagine, pretend you have a temporary or a permanent financial hardship. And you talk with your wife and you go, babe, we're short this month. Something isn't going to get paid. And for whatever reason, maybe the rent cannot get paid, or it cannot get paid on time. You've made that decision and you don't entirely know what the consequences are. You don't get evicted on the second. You know that. You know that much, but you don't know when you do, who does it, what does it look like, And I talk to tenants, they get a late notice on their door. We call it the notice to quit. And they call me up and go, hey, listen, like, I can't be out by this weekend. And you're like, I didn't need you to be out this weekend, calm down. And so that's really what I see tenants thinking. And if you can tell them, this is what's going to happen, this is how long it's going to take, and these are your options in the situation, you've just empowered them to make the best possible decision. And hopefully, if it's a temporary hardship, they can overcome it with a loan from a family member or something like this, maybe a payroll advance. But if it's more permanent, they can go, well, maybe I can scrape it together this month, but I'm certainly not going to keep it together. I need to change my housing situation. And if they know that from the beginning of the process, I don't think any states move so quickly that it's unreasonable that a tenant couldn't get it together and move somewhere.
Yeah. One of the things too is like, you don't know what this tenant's former situation was like and what that relationship was like with that landlord or property manager.
Oh yeah.
Maybe they came from a position where that landlord, they could just tell them, hey, like I'll get it to you when I can get it to you. And that landlord just said, okay. And then they pay 4 months later. So they may be conditioned thinking that that's how things operate, where that's not how they operate in your situation.
Totally. Their past experience absolutely informs their current experience, including what is this going to look like? How contentious is this going to get? And what can they expect as far as leniency? I think that's huge. I think one thing you also show a tenant through this process is when you call, when you email, I'm the landlord, I'm going to answer. I'm going to answer your question. Whether it's about this, whether it's about that leaking faucet, I'm still going to fix your leaking faucet. I have done work orders on properties where the eviction actually happens the next day, because
Mhm.
I don't shirk my duties. I feel strongly in the lease, I don't budge on rent. You shouldn't budge on what I'm responsible for. We have responsibilities to each other.
Sure.
And so, making sure we're there and a question can get answered is huge. And it just keeps people from reacting strongly, from getting aggressive, from getting, vindictive in your property. Nobody wants that.
What's what's the maybe it doesn't have to be in one of your situations, but what's the worst you've heard of a vindictive tenant on the way out?
Oh no, I've had it.
Yeah. I was
um,
giving you an out if you
I
wanted to,
got I got three good ones. In one case, they ripped the electric meter off the side of the building.
Mhm.
The unit was so full of stuff. It was about knee deep and it was all covered in urine. Like multiple people had to have urinated on it in order for there to be this much urine. Another one, they had a lot of like aquatic tanks, and
Yeah.
they left them all to evaporate the air in the summer. That
Ugh.
was a barfer.
Yeah.
Like I when cleaning out that unit, we barfed. And another one, they left so much trash, the maggots got into it, and it
Mhm.
covered a 10-unit building in flies. A white 10-unit building looked black for the flies.
Yeah.
Tough stuff, and that's stuff that just it's vindictive. It's not well planned,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's happened. I'm trying to think
So
of drywall missing, stuff like that.
yeah, I think the worst what we've heard, and any of our podcast listeners have listened enough, the worst we heard is somebody dumped a bag of concrete down the toilet, so it like seized up and the lines going out to the road. I was like, that's pretty vindictive.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
nobody wants that.
So
Yeah.
your your advice is when you're going through the process, educate and inform the tenant as you're going through. Take the emotions out, which we talk about all the
Yeah.
time. So now you've educated the tenant. They've got the pay or quit notice on their door. What are the next steps? Like, what do you recommend to people as you're going through this process?
Um, well, step one is control your own emotions. So,
Mhm.
like at this step of the process, you've informed them. Maybe they're making decisions you don't like, that they're not paying you, and maybe there's evidence that they have money. I just had one of these. The tenant is going to concerts, getting their hair done, maybe buying even a new car through this process. It's real tempting to get, I call it mean girl gossip, like they're doing this and that, and they're not paying me my rent. I'm going to say it doesn't matter. I'm going to say, if you want to do that in your recliner at home with your family, you do it a little bit and then you let it go. You absolutely do not approach the tenant and go, how are your nails done? How do you have this new car? It's just none of your business. It
Mhm.
really serves nothing. And that can be hard for landlords to do. Now, the other part is, like, the hearing is a hard thing for the tenant to do. And I think all states, you have to stand in front of a judge at some point. I know we do. One thing I'll do is let the tenant know beforehand, hey, the hearing's coming up tomorrow. You've likely never done this before. Do you want to know about what's going to happen there? Like, do you want to know how this works? And sometimes I do it in the waiting room ahead of time, because sometimes they don't return your call. But I just did it on Monday. We're in the waiting room and I could kind of see the panic in their eyes. And I go, hey, you've never been through this before. When we go in there, you're going to sit at the left-hand table. When the judge comes in, we're going to stand up and we're going to not sit down until he tells us to. And then he's going to ask me a bunch of questions and he's going to ask you a bunch of questions. And if our answers don't match, then he's going to get to the bottom of it. But I brought the whole file, and we'll make sure we get the questions answered. And if you don't know something, you don't know something, and make sure you ask any and all questions you have until you're done, until you are confident you understand. And you can see it in their face, just go like, okay. Yeah, because sometimes people mistakenly think after the hearing they're homeless. People think I'm leaving here and maybe I get to get a duffel bag.
Yeah.
They think these things. And so I find even just giving them some counseling about that, because if you've never been to one, well, you said you've luckily never had an eviction, right? When we were talking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you had to have one, would you reach out to someone in advance and go, hey, like, what's going to happen in that courtroom? I would assume, right? Who does this person have to call?
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I'm so, like, I don't know if anal is the right word for it, but like just going to a new business I've never been to. Like, I want to, like, sometimes I'll look it up on Google Street View and see what the front of it looks like. So then I know at the front door and everything, and like be able to go to it and know exactly what's happening. Like, I want to know what I'm getting into 100% as I'm going into it. So an
Right.
eviction would be like, I would probably, if I've got your cell phone number, I'm going to call you like the day before. I'm going to probably call you on the way in and
Mhm.
maybe put you in my pocket and just like have a little earpiece and be like, Jen, what do I do?
Right? Well, and I know when I trained, I was so lucky. The judge where I worked, he did all the LTs, we call them landlord tenant complaints, at the same time once a week.
Okay.
So you did spend a long time in that room if you weren't at the top of the stack, but you got to watch a bunch of situations go in front of the judge. And I learned a ton. And I'll say, I mean, I think you could probably call up your local judge if you were beginning to face this and go, hey, do you have any landlord tenant hearings coming up that I could sit in and watch as an observer, a member of the public? Definitely look to do that. And if your tenant's freaked out, I mean, I tell them, go ahead. You know, I'm not scared of my tenant coming to the trial. I'm not scared, or the hearing. I'm not scared of my tenant knowing something because I'm in the right. You know, they're not going to prove it wrong that they paid me in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the advantage to you to educate them through this part of the process? Like, let's say you're talking to them in the waiting room before they go in and you've done this. I mean, I understand it's a nice thing to do. You're helping ease their anxiety, but what's the benefit for you to do that?
Oh my gosh, the hearing goes so smoothly. It just goes smoothly. The judge asks you your questions, they ask them. The answers are going to match because there's no evidence otherwise. And otherwise, if they were anxious, upset, they're interrupting the judge. They're asking weird questions. They're not using the right vocab. They're behaving in a way that, one, embarrasses them, so it doesn't help the situation. It makes them more complacent entirely. Because again, if they don't have any evidence that they've paid in some way, but they're nervous and they think they need to fight back, then they're just bringing up crazy stuff. I mean, stuff that you could never foresee. And so I think if the smoother and the lower the emotions are, it keeps it safer and quicker and easier. It just, they're not poised, you know, there's always an appeal period afterward. And that has different requirements to it. I've never been appealed on, but I think part of why I've never been appealed on is that went so smoothly. You know, they realize like, oh, this is just kind of a train that's going down the track and it's going to keep going until I do what I have to do to stop it, or it reaches the end of the track and we're done and you don't have a house anymore, at least with us.
Yeah.
And so that's the advantage. The smoother you can keep it. And I worry too about myself and about staff. When you're interacting with people that you're taking their home from, I mean, that's huge. It doesn't matter how rightful you are. It's a huge upset in someone's life. It's always the thing they remember. It's sometimes a rock bottom for people. You got to be sensitive to it, and you got to recognize that it could excite someone so much that they could want to hurt you. You know, and that happens. We see you bring us news stories all the time about stuff that goes sideways and wrong, and you got to just know that you can make it easier.
All right. So let's say that you get a favorable outcome through the eviction process here. What's going on next? What kind of advice would you give somebody?
You're coming back and you're telling them, okay, so now we've reached this point of the process, and just like a person who's never been there before, you're telling them again what happens from this point, and always informing them, because the judges don't always speak in plain language to the tenants. You know, they have kind of a prescribed language, so you can kind of dumb it down. I love to take a calendar with me, and once the hearing's over and we're back in that waiting room, I go, okay, so what happened now is I got a judgment, and this is what that means. And then on this, like, so you have to pay this to stay in the unit. Now, on this date, this happens, this date, this happens, this date, this happens. You understand? At any point, you can stop this with this payment. And they look at you and they're so grateful. And if you as a landlord decide to issue a payment plan at that point, maybe you want to work with them a little bit, but with the security of having the judgment, you could work that payment plan out there. And I find after the hearing, you get the truth of the matter. I find that they will tell you different kinds of stories about their intentions and abilities prior to the hearing. After the hearing, it's, I'm going to be real with you. I lost my job. You know, this thing happened. I've got $100. And you can say in that moment, okay, so it sounds like we're going to go down the path of moving you on to a new home. You know, that sounds like that would be the best for you. So you can do this voluntarily. And I always encourage them, do not play with the eviction date. The eviction date is the eviction date. That's the date the constable, I show up, and somebody to change the locks, you need to leave. Like, so don't think that it's negotiable at that point. Don't think that it's movable or that you can call the day before and move it. Because at that point, in our state anyway, it's out of my control. If the judgment hasn't been satisfied and I've gotten the order of possession and the constable appointment is set, it's not movable. Now it's outside of my hands. And I'm always clear with that with people too. Like, I'm in control until this point. At this point, though, the court process has taken over and I can't stop it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just about being super, super, super clear at every single point.
Jenn, do you, maybe you haven't ever used this, but like cash for keys, some landlords will say they swear by it. Other ones are like, there's no way I'm ever paying a bad renter to get out of the apartment. Do you have any opinion on that at all?
I've never done it. Now,
Yeah.
I'm in a particularly landlord-friendly state. I mean, that's the thing about PA. It takes 6 weeks, and
Yeah.
I'm not proud, but well over 100 evictions. You know, I've just done enough. I've never had a problem. I could imagine a scenario for us here that if the laws changed and it was harder,
Mm-hmm.
or if there was something about the situation, maybe I didn't have the lease, maybe the lease had an error in it, maybe there's something disadvantaging me in the facts of the case,
Mm-hmm.
that I would want to do something like that. I'm actually facing a situation right now. It was Monday or Tuesday night, maybe. I met with a church, and I have a lot of churches for clients because they have these properties, these parsonages and things that they don't use for clergy anymore because they have part-time clergy. And so in this case, it's a 2-unit, and I think the rents are like $450, which is super low anyway. But the one was delinquent $8,200, and the other was delinquent over $5,000.
Wow.
Imagine this is well over a year in
Yeah.
rent that the church didn't know what they were doing. So I've got out-of-date leases that are really subpar. I've got a variety of payment plans that have been made over this time with the pastor and the people. And the pastor is not an ideal lease enforcement person.
Sure.
Their skills lie in a different place.
Well, he told me he would pay next month. So
Yeah, and it's so sweet. These people are so sweet, and they're just trying to manage the church's asset. In that situation, we might think about it, but I think we have a good plan of attack otherwise with this one. But I hear about it all the time. It's just not done here. It's probably because our system is so favorable to us. It's not a hard thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. That would be a hard one to swallow, though, I got to tell you.
Yeah. So as far as the going through all these, you learn every single time you go through one. Is there like one thing in particular that you found, like, because I'm sure you look back and think, all right, what went wrong with that tenant? Like, what was the situation? Maybe the tenant just lost their job. Okay. Do we look at what their job history is like more scrutiny? Have you found anything like that where you've scrutinized your process throughout everything and made tweaks?
I've got a terrific example.
Okay.
I had used a service like yours for years and years and years. And I was using them, and I got this tenant, and we'd screened them, met our qualifications, no eviction history, and I rented to her. And when it all went sideways, the way she behaved led me to believe that she had been through this before. And I thought, that is so weird. So I did what I often do. And I go back to the app and I go, did I miss something here? Like, did I make a wrong decision? And when I saw the addresses, I know. I checked the county database on those addresses and saw who owned them. And a friend of mine owned one. So I called him up and I said, hey, this person, this name, did you ever rent to her? He goes, oh yeah. And I evicted her. I said, oh my gosh, in court, you went through the whole process. There should be a public record. He said, yeah. And actually, so did my other friend, one of these other addresses. We both did.
Okay.
So I got myself all hopped up, because I was mad at my screening reports provider, who I'd been assured was checking all these public records.
Sure.
This would have been, it was before the public records came off the credit reports. Anyway, what happened in Pennsylvania was the courts stopped reporting the address. So the only piece of information on those records is the name.
Okay.
So you couldn't double verify with a date of birth, social number, address. I was furious that I wasn't made aware. Now, since then, what we've done, of course, we pull all the checks we get through our provider, but then we also check our docket system in Pennsylvania. We pull anything with a matching name, which of course is not assuming it's theirs. But if you get some, then you look at who owned the property. Then you look at the records of what properties they own, and hopefully you have an address on one of those properties that matches the credit report. And then usually with the right kind of questions, we can get them to fess to it. But that's the level we're going to, is starting to research anything with their name, what do they own, and then trying to cross-reference. We call it Nosy Nellie's detective agency at Fish Property Management. The leasing agent's going, I found this, how do I do this? And I'm like, we're going to put our head together and think about it, because we're not going to leave any stone unturned. Yeah.
And I mean, realistically, you might be looking at 10, 15 minutes of extra work doing that. But when you compare that to, the 6-week eviction process, and then your time of having to go to the courts, and it's, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure kind of thing.
I tell the leasing agents all the time, because they're frustrated when they work so hard and go through an app and they find something and it's declined. That's frustrating for them. I go, you need to know this frustration, this time, whatever you spent is such an asset to our client. You just saved them this huge financial loss. You saved our office this headache. You saved the potential for this work. That was the best thing you did this week. And you might have leased 3 units, but you saved one of our clients from the worst thing that can happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So somebody who's really in a rush to fill a vacancy, step back, take a second, maybe look at the local county records, see if the information's matching up for who they said the landlord is of that property, and taking those extra precautions that you're talking about in your situation in Pennsylvania, it's well worth it.
Oh, absolutely. And we had no idea. So I see that we have to check these things. I need to be having probably annual meetings with my screening reports provider and saying, what's changing? What's happening? What do I need to be doing differently to make sure I'm getting all this information I'm counting on?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Jen, do you have any kind of parting words as far as for somebody who's going through the eviction process as a landlord property manager for the first time? I mean, what would you tell them?
If you don't know what you're doing, invest in the help and education that you need to know what you're doing and to be as expert as possible. Keep your emotions down. There's one other thing I had thought about when I was thinking about your listeners who are private landlords mostly. One thing I see very, very routinely is with the private landlord and tenants is that they're mixing the lease and other work arrangements. So maybe they're allowing them to paint, like maybe they're sealing the deck and they've bought the materials, or maybe they're putting, some sort of improvement into the property in exchange for labor, or they barter, especially when people get delinquent. This is something people love to do. And I'm going to say, if you're it's entirely ill-advised. Really, really ill-advised. Just don't, I would say first, don't do it. But if you're going to do it, you need to write a separate written agreement for that contract for the work in exchange for money. So if they're going to put a deck on the house or repair the deck on the house, you're going to say, this is the scope of work. This is what you're going to be paid. And landlord, you're going to pay them. Then with the lease, they're also going to pay. And it might mean you're exchanging checks for the same amount and getting receipts for the same amount. But the reason you're doing that is in most states, the landlord-tenant hearing and rules and consequences are very separate from the civil hearing and consequences. So if you put this messed up situation in front of a judge where like the roof's not done and the materials aren't there and the rent's not paid and the unit's damaged, what is the judge going to do for you? Like there just isn't. Let's make it really easy for him to check that first box, which is judgment granted, possession granted. Let's keep it separate. And that is a huge thing that landlords could be doing that they're not doing right now.
Okay. I think that's great advice because, that definitely comes up where people start thinking like, should I let them paint the rental to take a little bit off the rent because they're having trouble paying? And just don't do it.
Just say no. Just say no. You're going to think, oh, maybe I should. Just get it, paint it on the wall. No.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
So if anyone's listening and they're like, you know what, I really like what she's saying. I'm actually pretty close to her location in Pennsylvania. How can they learn more about your company, Jen?
You want to go to my website. You want to go to www.fishpm.com. On there, you're going to see a lot about how we operate. You're going to see our application criteria. And of course, for our tenants and maybe even for owners, they're going to see how we do just an exceptional job marketing units and then vetting our tenants.
One last tip. So, for somebody who's listening, they're thinking about going to a property manager. What's your best tip for vetting a property manager for somebody who might be thinking about that?
Best tip for vetting a property manager. You should be making sure that they're educated and they're keeping up with their education. So, there's not a lot of like property management master's degrees. That's not what I mean. Do they belong to an association where they're actively participating in education? That could be something like NARPM. The National Association of Rental Property Managers. It could be IRM, the Institute for Real Estate Management. It also could be like an apartment association, that they're actively keeping up because it's changing every day. It's changing all the time. And, listening to podcasts like yours are making us aware of those changes. But I see a lot of property managers out there who are doing things the wrong way, an old way. And I just feel bad for anybody who's working with them that they're not getting an expert service. They're not getting truly what they need.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, thank you for all your insights, and hopefully somebody listening to this, whether you're going through it right now or it's just being educated beforehand, because like you said, if you got enough rentals and you're in it long enough, it's bound to happen. Don't feel like you failed, but make sure
Right.
you do the best with your current circumstance and situation as you go through it. And I think that's what this podcast episode is all about.
Well, I welcome the opportunity. I'm so glad I got to talk to you today.
All right. Thanks, Jenn. Take care.